Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or whenever you should happen to find this. This is the 7th episode of the Quote of Arms podcast. I'm here talking with...
Hey everyone, it's Cole, also known as Eclipsemeteor from Uncommon Commanders. How's it going today, Coach?
It's going pretty well, thanks. So we're here to talk about which tribe?
Well, we are here to talk about Sphinx Tribal.
Nice. It's awesome to hear some facts about Sphinxes, which is going to be a bit of a tongue twister.
little bit. I mean, each and every single one of these Sphinxes have, not only are they not identical to one another, but they all do various different abilities that may or may not coincide with one another.
Awesome. So to start off, what are Sphinxes?
Well, to those of the uninitiated, Sphinxes are usually giant, human-faced and lion-bodied creatures in mythology that often ask travelers and people's riddles. And in Magic the Gathering, they're usually big, blue, flying creatures of that same description that usually have an interesting ability involving deck manipulation, drawing cards, or influencing your opponents in some way.
So if they have human faces and lion bodies, how do they fly?
They fly. Well, they also tend to have wings on their back.
There we go.
Most of them are feathered. Some of them are webbed.
Are they webbed like the wax ones from Icarus and...
Well, if you look at something like Consecrated Sphinx, which was originally from New Phyrexia, you kind of see it has sort of this insectoid gossamer style look. If you look at something like Dream Eater, if you kind of look deep and closely at it, you kind of see this sort of bat-like webbed outline in the shadows. But for the rest of them, most of the time, they're just feathered wings.
No. I would wonder how the ones that aren't feathered fly, but that's interesting. Okay. So, you mentioned that they are large, flying, blue creatures. They kind of like blues answer to dragons.
Well, they're blues. They're the blues equivalent of, if I recall correctly, hydras, demons, dragons, and angels.
Neat. So, you get that they are relatively large flyers. But are they just large in size, or do they have other abilities that go with that?
Well, traditionally you'll see a lot of them with flying. Some of them may have additional keywords like flash, hexproof. But in general, a lot of them have interesting abilities that involve, like I said earlier, deck manipulation of some kind, whether it be you simply get to draw additional cards. Some of them involve milling yourself or milling opponents. Some involve being able to recast instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard, or even tutoring cards from your deck, or looking through your opponent's deck and basically playing a mini game between you and your opponent as to what you chose.
So you mentioned top deck manipulation through things like scrying and drawing. Are there some that just kind of look at it?
Yeah, so if we look over at one of the more recent releases, something like you let a deck like Elegath, Crossroads, Augur, which says if you would scry a number of cards, draw that many instead. You want to look at some like...
Well, you remember Sphinx of Dwar Isle? We used to call it Dwar Sphinx.
Oh, well, but that's slightly different in that you're only able to look at the top card of your library at any time, but not necessarily do anything with it.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about some of them not necessarily scrying formally, but just looking.
Some of the lower rarity ones, like Horizon Scholar, when it enters the battlefield, it allows you to scry. Prognostic Sphinx, when it attacks, it allows you to scry 3.
Mm-hmm.
Sphinx of Foresight, if you reveal it from your opening hand at the first turn, you're able to scry 3 at the beginning of your first upkeep, and then afterward, when it's in play, at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to scry 1. But it also has another couple abilities, like from the third time we returned to Ravnica, the Surveil ability, which allows you to look at the top X cards of your library and either keep them on top or put them into your graveyard.
And there was a new addition to that from Modern Horizons. The card with Surveil there. But they have high mana values, and they look at things at the top of the library, or they can manipulate the top of the library. So, are there some interesting keywords or effects that could have to do with that?
Well, one of my personal favorites, ever since I've started playing was, Classic Sphinx of Athun. That's usually pretty good. I'm more of a favorite of Chance. No, I'm screwing this up.
That's okay. Do you remember the ability Clash?
I've only played with it a few times. I'm not where you get to reveal the top card of your library, and if you have the higher CMC, you gain either an additional or just simply more beneficial effect.
So that's a way to incorporate top deck manipulation and large mana values. Just an interesting way of doing the couple of things that Sphinxes do really well. You mentioned that they have... what's up?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, probably one of the best ways for Sphinxes to sort of synergize with the deck is setting up a top deck, or perhaps just simply using an effect like Unesh Cryosphinx Sovereign, which turns your Sphinxes into Fact or Fictions. And some of the early setup and synergies with your deck, such as Brainstorm effects, being able to reload or reshuffle your library in a certain way. It allows you to maybe even evade some discard effects, or even get rid of a problematic card that you might not be able to cast immediately, but you might be able to cast later.
Neat. And there is another kind of effect that has a higher mana value than you might actually wind up paying for, and involves the top of the deck. That's where there can even be an Esper colored.
Perhaps like Yannette, Cryptic Sovereign.
And Yannette is part of a precon, and in that precon there's a lot of top deck manipulation, including miracle effects.
Well, if you really wanted to get off a Terminus, I'm trying to think of a blue one, but that's like a Terminus, or
there's
3D equals.
There's a Terminus is also it's a tuck effect. There's a or is it a tuck effect? It's a temporal eddy effect. There's also the bounce all non-land permanents if you need to. They are relatively high mana value, which can mean that you can get behind, say, like an elf deck, but Devastation Tide is a way to recoup some of that lost value and force them to discard some of the excess that they can't play because they hampered themselves on mana and played too many mana dorks instead.
In addition to that strategy, you could also focus on massive sleep effects that lock the board down even for more than a full turn rotation. It also really helps out with other opponents' flying creatures.
Absolutely. And they can be a way to sort of sneak your way back into the game or bash through for some extra damage.
It is essentially the main issue by playing Sphinxes isn't necessarily just that your mana values are high. It's just what's the additional win con, in which case, well, you are a big flying body, which definitely helps in combat. But also a few of the abilities of even the legendary Sphinxes you might have as your commander also allow you to end the game by a certain win condition that might be on the card.
So, tell me about Eclipsemeteor.
Well, Eclipsemeteor, all-seeing, it's a 6-mana, 4/5 flying Sphinx with the ability 2 in blue, to tap to draw 2 cards and discard a card. And then Eclipsemeteor says, whenever Eclipsemeteor all-seeing deals damage to an opponent, you may reveal your hand if cards with at least 6 different converted mana value costs, which is now what is the it's not mana value, it's I can't remember the term now.
No, the term for it is mana value.
Oh, is it? Oh,
yeah.
I was thinking you could still sync CMC. But anyway.
It's just X different mana values. Yeah.
Yes. Reveal this way that player loses the game. Meaning, and it synergizes with the numerous Sphinxes that are across different CMCs. You reveal your hand, you just simply win the game.
Now, the reveal happens on resolution of the effect, so you can still do things with it on the stack. One of the unsummons I've wanted to do, because I am the unsummoned skull, I love using unsummons in innovative ways, is to unsummon one of your own creatures to meet the requirement. So somebody thinks
you get this bounce in response.
So let's say you have a couple of different 1-drops, like let's say you have a brainstorm and that. Maybe you keep the brainstorm in hand, but you unsummon a creature to make sure that you have different mana values represented. Because the Brainstorm might not hit something that has a different mana value, but the creature, or the unsummon of the creature will.
It's guaranteed.
Mm-hmm. So that might be, as long as you have one out, but yeah.
You could also, although Brainstorm is one of the options, you could also just have another draw effect in the hand, which would help close out. And of course, a land also counts as mana value 0.
Mm-hmm. And so does Chrome Mox.
True.
So sometimes you need to be able to vary those mana values, and an unsummon could be a cool way to doing that. That's one of the unsummon effects I haven't used yet. I'm always trying to find new ways to use it.
It is Unsummon's versatility, dodging removal, being able to have a new ETB off your creature, bouncing an opponent in a key moment. It's definitely useful, especially when you're playing blue.
Oh yeah, I play them all different colors, but yeah. So, is there a set identity, or do they kind of do different things?
In a general sense, I do believe one of the best ways to have a coherent Sphinx deck isn't necessarily the fringe abilities that don't synergize. It's the ones where you want to be able to draw cards in some way, shape, or form. Whether or not you're able to look at them before you do it or afterward or not, it's not a guaranteed thing. But being able to draw cards and also use your graveyard as a resort, or recasting some of them later, is, I think, part of the identity of Sphinxes.
So, being able to use the graveyard, being able to manipulate the top deck of your library, and being large flyers.
Basically, essentially.
So, you mentioned alternate win cons, you mentioned winning with giant flyers. Is there a third way that Sphinx deck could win?
Well, one of the ways I've found is through the use of Unesh Cryosphinx Sovereign as the commander, but you could also use it with Ormos Archive Keeper. Essentially, you're going to be drawing a lot of cards by playing a lot of Sphinxes, or perhaps just simply drawing a lot of cards and discarding a lot of cards. You'll want to look for your fastest Oracle effects, or anything that counts how many cards you have left in your deck, or if you would draw the next card in your library, and you would simply win the game.
Nice, and there's actually a couple of Sphinxes now with Cascade, which is nice.
Yes, and if you do go 3-color, traditionally in Esper colors, you will be able to synergize with those spells pretty well.
So what about Magister Sphinx?
So in Magister Sphinx's case, we're playing blue, black, and white. When it enters the battlefield, target player's life total becomes 10. This is something you see with Soren Markov's effect, where it can bring a table or a single player down to a quarter of their life and make it incredibly easy to finish them off just through combat. You could clone it, which also ties into just simply having more Sphinxes.
Mm-hmm. You could play something like not Decree of Pain. What was it?
That to the Deathless?
No, I'm thinking of the Echo. There's a Mana Echo, so there's Pain Echoes, maybe. I don't remember exactly the name of the card, but the one that deals damage equal to the number of damage, or equal to the amount they've already taken, because technically having your life total reset does have
Count as life damage?
loss. Yeah, it counts as life loss.
True, but there is a difference between life loss and being dealt damage, and the clauses of each of those cards is entirely dependent on that.
Okay, so yeah, it's a Shadowmoor card that I was thinking of.
Oh, I was thinking of Wound Reflection. Yeah. Because it's still technically, like you said, it counts as a loss of life, which also counts damage.
Mm-hmm. They lose life equal to the life they've already lost this turn. So resetting their life total counts as life loss, so Wound Reflection would take them out.
Which is pretty dirty.
As long as they were above 20.
There was a brief history with Magister Sphinx in my playgroup when we first started playing back around, I want to say 2011 or 2012, where we house banned Magister Sphinx because our clone effects were pretty rampant back then, and everyone just took advantage of it.
Oh yeah, and it also sounds like something where a little bit similar to the Emerical ban, where Emerical wasn't banned because it was so problematic in your deck. It's because it warped the game around itself, and so people would do things like bribery Emerical from someone else, even if they weren't playing it themselves.
I mean, at least I found from playing around that time, how clones have been used has been changed with the legend rule change that happened a few years ago. And since then, where I do see less Magister Sphinxes, or maybe I just see less Esper decks in general, most people carry less clone effects unless they're dedicated towards it, and then if they do have more than one, like access to more than one clone at a time, it'll eventually devolve into exploiting one creature into a dominant board state.
So you mentioned Unesh and Unesh's ability so the Factor Fiction ability. Unesh is the typical giant flyer. It does have an ability that references specifically Sphinxes and does something about that large mana value.
I mean, you get to turn other 5 and 6 mana Sphinxes into 3 and 4 costs, which when you turn the clock up that quickly, suddenly you're churning out Factor Fiction effects pretty much every time you cast a spell into other Sphinxes.
So what is the ability that does that? You said it turns the cost into another cost.
Well, it just simply says Sphinx spells you cast cost 2 less to cast.
There we go. So it's essentially a double medallion for Sphinxes specifically.
And if you wanted to, make it even more of a reduced cost, you could play a medallion, or you could play Kefnit's Monument, which is one of my personal favorite artifacts that synergizes really well with this.
Absolutely. And some of the ways to produce mana would be in artifacts, and back once upon a time you could untap all your artifacts when you cast a spell.
We don't talk about ban cards here. That was a time and era I would prefer to forget.
I mean, we did just talk about a ban card, or a card that was banned in your meta.
Well, true, but there's a difference between a Rule 0 a personal one-on-one based banning versus a commander based rules committee based banning.
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is this is one of the decks that was able to exploit that, because if you could do something like that with, say, Cloudstone Curio out, you can just keep pancake flippering back your Sphinxes. Factor Fiction each time.
I guess Cloudstone Curio does still count their full CMC. So yeah, you could end up cycling through a bunch of your deck by allowing these Sphinxes to come back to your hand, and then eventually you ended off with a Laboratory Maniac, a Jace Wielder of Mysteries, or a Thassa's Oracle.
Yeah. Harder to do, though, without repeatedly untapping the artifacts, unless you're going to do something like make infinite mana, which certainly there are ways to do, especially in Esper colors.
I mean, we are dealing with artifacts. You could go the classic route of
Scepter Reversal? Or is that not classic enough?
Well, it's not one I would personally play.
Okay.
Dramatic Reversal continuously. Not my style.
Mm-hmm.
When I played Sphinxes, it was simply maintain a tempo of the board, being able to sort of weave Sphinxes in where necessary, and even during a board wipe, just simply having enough in my hand to start resetting.
So are you using Sphinxes more as an offensive and evasive tribe?
It was primarily my experience with them. I always liked playing decks sort of in an off-brand way. I like playing green. I've always liked playing green, and being able to play big blue Sphinxes for cheap, and also being able to be aggressive with them in my tables, at least, has always been a fun experience. And Unesh primarily was the reason why I was able to do it.
So you're making You were playing green and blue then.
This was before Partners came out.
Mm-hmm.
I think back then, if they had already existed, it'd probably be Elegath, Crossroads Augur, and most likely the new Kodama.
Interesting. So I was
But back
thinking
then,
maybe
it
Elegath and
was.
Caidell. Or Elegath.
Sorry, what was that?
I was thinking Elegath and there's a 2 mana that scries. But if you're going with I wonder if Karuga could get in on that.
I mean, hey, if you're playing a high cost deck, I mean, it would be the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Elegath, Kodama, Karuga. I could see Hermit Druid getting in on that.
Oh, I mean, geez. I mean, if we're really leaning into just the sheer disgustingness, I mean, if you're able to give these Sphinxes haste and you're throwing them out as fast as you possibly can, I mean, oh boy.
Yeah, we're
and
talking.
Then, hey, they're all done. Reload the hand with Karuga. Keep going.
Yeah, we're talking about Magister Wound Reflection here, so they're not pulling punches.
No, and in this type of deck, especially with this sort of tribal interaction, you really can't.
Mm-hmm. And there are some there are some red as well with Aryan.
True. Arjuna's Shifting Flame was a bit difficult, I've found, to work with, especially when you kind of look at other Izzet contemporaries. If you had a Locus God as part of the deck, I imagine the effect would be pretty useful.
That would be another big flyer.
It would be another big flyer and an army of small flyers.
Yeah. You want to control the skies? We can control the skies.
And I mean, if the problem I found with sort of blue-red Sphinxes is that you do gain access to a lot more red's clone effects, which I think really help out in making numerous copies of, I'd say maybe a Chancellor of the Spires, perhaps. Another consecrated Sphinx, Dream Eater, which is one of my personal favorite Sphinxes from the last few years, where you're able to, if you do Surveil 4, or when you do, you may return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to their hand, which is very powerful if you're able to copy numerous Dream Eaters.
Yeah, Dream Eater is another unsummon effect, so that makes me happy. Also has the surveil ability, which is nice.
I mean, you could also pair it up with a Riddlemaster Sphinx, but only the Riddlemaster Sphinx returns creatures, but still an unbelievably powerful effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you get the Unesh Pancake Flipper engine going, you can always surveil most of the library, and then you get into some of the other win conditions. Especially since you have a lot of blue pips, you don't even have to get rid of the whole library for something like Thoracle.
One of my favorite ways to sort of reload my deck, if I had either had my my Laboratory Maniac exiled or removed and inaccessible, I did like casting Cyclic Spiral, which is a 5-mana instant, which you return all your cards from your library to your deck and shuffle, and a target opponent mills that many cards that you had shuffled in. And if they're a graveyard type deck, if you manage to empty their library before they even had a chance to find their personal win cons, then, well, that's just one less player to deal with.
Yeah, I have one with something like that before. You could also do something with Tunnel Vision. I'm not sure you remember that old Ravnica card.
Tunnel Vision.
You name a card, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal the named card. But if you scry or in some way put the Thoracle on the bottom of your library, boom, that's a win.
You know, I don't think I've ever heard of this card until now.
Oh, there's all kinds of silly things you can do. I used to use it as a self-mill engine.
I mean, my first thought is Mad Spirit, I think. Mirror Bad Phantasm, I think, was one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Being able to flip through your library that way too.
5/1 with flying, and then you mill until you re-hit your Mirror Mad Phantasm. But What if you don't have a Mirror Bad Phantasm in your library?
Mm-hmm. It was Mind Shrieker was a way to win with that too.
True, Mindshaker, you banish Exile when your big Sphinx is off the top. You're able to beat face or just continue the mill engine.
Mm-hmm.
And you could also cast Traumatize, being able to just mill the top half of someone's library, whether it be your own or your opponent's. Is sort of the setup for a win con that I think only Sphinxes and a very dedicated mill deck can pull off.
Mm-hmm. Sphinx Minebreaker is a nice one if you're looking to mill. ETB, each opponent mills 10 cards. That's from Theros Beyond Death.
If I'm correct, and I might be forgetting this, I think that was part of it wasn't part of the main set, it was part of the sort of tribal decks or packs.
It's part of a theme booster. Yeah.
That was it, yes.
One of the ones that I've used before, and I've seen it used in Standard as well, is Sphinx of the Final Word.
Sphinx of the Final Word. Again, tying into the instant sorcery synergy from earlier. It's instant sorcery spells you control can't be countered, and the Sphinx itself can't be countered.
Mm-hmm.
And itself has hexproof, so you sort of have this ability to cast your, if you really want to go the route, your cyclonic rifts, your counter spells with imputiny. No one can really match up to that.
It was a solid control finisher. Then a combo finisher, an example of a combo finisher, which people like to cheat into play, was Sphinx of the Steelwind.
I mean, that is a card after my own heart. It's got everything I would want in terms of just big body, a bunch of keywords, and because of its artifact creature nature, a protection from red and green, which is exactly what you need. I mean, this is everything I dream for and dream of in a Magic card.
Oh yeah, and brutal when it bashes on people.
I mean, you're able to play offensively and defensively with it, and you're gaining life every time it makes contact with something. It's a pretty powerful creature.
Absolutely. So, what are a couple of your other favorites?
Oh, I guess as a list, just to go off of, Chancellor of the Spires, I think, is one of my favorite sort of interactions with opponents. You may reveal it from your opening hand at the beginning of the game, and if you do, at the beginning of the first upkeep, each opponent puts the top 7 cards of their library into their graveyards. Depending on the game and the type of deck your opponent has, could be backfire tremendously. But its clause of when it enters the battlefield, you may cast target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost is important because it allows you to flicker or copy the Chancellor again and cast the same spell because it doesn't exile it.
So when you say cast the same spell, so it operates almost like Diluvian Primordial, where it allows you to play a spell from an opponent.
But in comparison to the Diluvian, which exiles the card after it's cast, Chancellor just simply puts it back into the graveyard, and if your opponent's not able to take advantage of it, you certainly will.
And then the first ability you were talking about, the milling ability, is a Leyline ability, so that happens as a game action before anybody takes a turn.
True. And the key word being is you may reveal this card. Sometimes it might not be beneficial to sort of flash this in and show everyone what's going on beforehand.
Yeah, sometimes you don't want to load up their graveyards if they are able to use it as well.
There was one time I did do that against a Hogak deck. And at first I was like, should I do this? And I looked over at the player and I'm like, that just seems funny, and I just simply revealed it. And everyone's like, why would you do that? And I was just an agent of chaos at that point. It just seemed really fun.
That reminds me of my Idris. I think we actually had this on this little discourse on the Discord. I have a Idris hypergenesis deck. So to cast anything 3 or less will go into hypergenesis. And so turn 3 hypergenesis, put out Blightsteel, a Dax duplicate of Blightsteel. I think it was a regular clone of Blightsteel, and Hogak.
Now that is quite disgusting.
Deck is silly.
Any spell that manages to either be able to cast something for free or have an effect with very minimal input. I mean, Consecrated Sphinx by itself just draws you a bunch of cards and can definitely have an entire table gang up on removing it or take advantage of it themselves.
Yeah, Consecrated Sphinx, we talked about what it looks like, but what does it do?
Well, it's a 6-mana 4/6 with flying, and it says whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards.
Which sounds pretty ridiculous, because people like to draw cards, right?
If you're playing Commander, and if you know some of the tenets of deck building, drawing cards, any form of card advantage is important, and Consecrated Sphinx is there to take advantage of your card advantage.
And then you hope that somebody doesn't play something like Hull Breach or Smothering Tithe.
That's, well, I mean, at that point, I think the focus has shifted from a Consecrated Sphinx over to a Hull Breacher.
So it is kind of interesting to see how an oppressive card can become less oppressive within certain metas, as long as people are understanding and accepting that those cards are going to be there.
I mean, if you look at Magic's history, at least within the last decade, power creep has been so noticeable that a lot of the cards that used to be powerhouses in their own standard metas are still considerably strong, but they're just not hailed as the be-all, end-all anymore. I'd say Consecrated Sphinx is one of those cards.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how power creep has affected that. It's still one of those cards where when somebody plays it out, you go, ugh. But
I feel as if I've seen less Consecrated Sphinxes and more Hull Breachers within, like, the last 6 months.
Yeah, and the part that frustrates me about seeing that is that it shows a shift from being proactive to being reactive.
And that's sort of Blue's nature kind of throughout its history by having access to a strong early control game and then later having these big beaters. And then later on in Magic's history, you start getting these effects that make a lot of both of these strategies very insignificant.
Yeah, and the creation of effects that win games in alternate ways that are not really that difficult to pull off. So it's reducing Blue's ability to win through traditional means and sort of shoehorning them down some of these different directions.
I mean, as at the same time, Blue's, I feel like Blue's had a bit of not an identity crisis like maybe some other colors have had, but I feel its effects have become more grounded and solidified, which is why when we look at a card like Hull Breacher, we think it's sort of the extreme side of Blue. But then we also look at Raven's Form or Reality Shift, which exiles a creature, which is not normally something Blue's capable of doing. We're sort of seeing this shift of what is Blue allowed to do? It's just not as egregious as the other colors.
Yeah, that was something I got into with Pixie Kitten actually yesterday when I was playing on Zuby's stream, where I like Blue and Pixie personally does not, and that's fine. But I think that also has to do with experiences with what Blue does. She enjoyed playing against my Blue Aristocrats deck, which was because for me, Blue is about possibilities and experimenting with the limits of what can be done. And so I like blue mixed with a little bit of red or a little bit of green. Blue is my favorite color because it's about questioning. It's about trying to find those answers. It's about possibilities rather than realities. And then you start getting some of those more grounded cards, and that goes against my identity of Blue, but not necessarily the identity of Blue.
I mean, how long have you played Magic?
I've been playing since Champions of Kamigawa, so for about 15 years.
Okay. And I mean, I guess we're kind of looking we're kind of looking at Sphinxes a bit through the same lens in terms of how they've evolved over time, but you feel as if this more cemented perception of what blue is capable of doing is, do you feel as it's hurtful to the game, or do you feel as if it's just personally affecting your ability to find interesting cards and use blue cards in interesting ways?
I don't think either of those is necessarily true. I think it's affecting my interest level in newer cards, but I do play a lot of older cards, and I can show people a lot of what I do with these older cards is just trying to find what I believe blue to be.
And I guess this is why I ended up playing Sphinxes about over a year ago or more, centered around Unesh, was that I saw the potential of playing a blue deck as a green deck, wherein that means reducing the cost of creature spells, having these big creatures come out with an evasion ability that wasn't trample, it was flying, and using these creatures to navigate the board in a way that felt familiar to me as a green player, but was a stark contrast to how blue is usually played in general.
And that's where Prismari and Quandrix come into me, which is kind of capturing or recapturing some of the whimsy that I like in blue. Again, about that experimentation, going beyond what you usually are expecting to see in a card, doing things that seem different and unusual and cool. There are some recent designs that have started to get into that.
Someone who invested more heavily in Lorehold. That said, I'm not as familiar with the more Prismari Quandrix route that they took, because the unfortunate thing is I looked at Quandrix and saw very familiar blue-green that I've been seeing for a decade. But when I looked at Prismari, you start seeing the absolute wacky, big, like blue-red spells that you traditionally don't see because you don't have access to the mana. But now here are the tools that allow you to do that.
What I mean by them doing something a little bit different is like, I did. I will say I did one of the first decks I made out of Quandrix was a blue-green landfall deck, which wound up feeling way too rote for me. I did make a Prismari deck, which was the Prismari deck I made, which is really fun, is a departure from a lot of blue decks that I've seen. It is Rutha. And what it's designed to do, because Rutha, of course, unsummons herself, so that fits me to a T. Cast gigantic X spells, but stop too short, and then pay Rutha's cost to return her to my hand, and double the giant X spell.
And Rutha also stands out in that she, obviously unrelated to the Sphinx conversation we're having, but a tribal one, in that you start seeing these creature types in Magic's history kind of be recontextualized within the set. Having an orc be a spellcaster when normally we've been seeing them as warriors and as pirates, seeing them sort of in this really bright and positive and interesting display as spellcasters is a really nice change of pace I think Magic's been seeing, at least within the last year or two.
Oh yeah, it's kind of funny because I recently made an Orc Berserker who has balanced stats, and so I'm trying to figure out exactly how that works, because he comes from a very not necessarily backwards, but a very old school family, and he was kicked out of his clan. So for him, everything relates back to axes, because axes were shown as the sign of strength. So he has his brain axe, he has his arm axe, his leg axe, his lower axe, because anything that has to do with strength he considers to be an axe.
So even a force of personality and a force of willpower is an axe.
Yep. So if somebody asks him, like, do you think wizards are strong? He'd say they are good at using their brain axes.
That's a pretty simple and straightforward way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
That's pretty great to bring to a table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting character that I built recently. But I mean, in terms of Quandrix shifting what blue does, I'm talking about, like, I recently made a blue, or I'm in the process of building a mono blue token stack with one of the Quandrix commanders. Not Quandrix colored, but...
Is it the one that makes, not inklings, it makes fractals?
I believe it makes fractals, but it also makes creature tokens unblockable.
Oh, that is pretty neat. That's pretty cool.
So that's an example of Quandrix doing something to shift the way that I view blue. There is the blue-green one from the Fractal deck, which makes creature tokens copies of it, I think. Or no, copies of non-legendary creatures.
Which is also very strong.
Mm-hmm. Which is also an interesting way of playing with the stack and playing with what blue can do. So I like that Strixhaven made Wizards a lot more playful with blue. But even before Strixhaven, and going back to the Sphinx discussion, there were some cards like Sphinx of the Second Sun. Beginning of your post-combat main phase, you get an additional beginning phase. And
which involves untapping, drawing, and having an upkeep trigger.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting way of messing with the rules, and you can always, because it's an additional beginning phase, not just untapping, upkeeping, and drawing. If you do something like Paradox Haze to give yourself an additional upkeep, you can do some really ridiculous shenanigans.
That was the first card that came to mind when you were talking about Sphinx of the Second Sun. Being able, I mean, obviously as phases change, it's difficult to utilize your mana effectively, unless of course you have access to a flash effect like Leyline of Anticipation, which I believe also really brings a Sphinx deck together, because you're able to play the defensive reactive game of being a blue player, but you're also able to utilize Sphinx of the Second Sun in a way where, as these phases are changing, maybe you want to have something to do before your untap upkeep trigger, before your draw step, as a sort of way as a setup.
Yeah, so there's some really neat things that can be done in that in those beginning phases. One of the ones I've used before is Riddlemaster Sphinx, because that's an unsummon effect on a giant blue creature.
I mean, classic. It's effective, and it's despite the 6 mana cost for it. 6 mana for a 5/5 flyer that bounces an opponent's creature. It's pretty useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I basically see it as 5 mana for a 5/5 creature, and then the 1 mana is an unsummon effect. It's a little bit more limited because it has to be an opponent and it has to be sorcery speed. But I played Void Snare before.
Another Sphinx, or at least another couple Sphinxes, I think are pretty interesting. That kind of, I'd say, match up to both Riddlemaster and even the Sphinx of the Second Sun. I'm a fan of Master of Predicaments. 5 mana, 4/4 flying, and then whenever the Master of Predicaments deals combat damage to a player, choose a card in your hand. The player guesses whether its mana value is greater than 4, and if they guess wrong, you get to cast the card for free.
Neat.
And then, as a fan of sleep effects, especially in this type of deck where you want to have holes in your opponent's defenses, Guardian of Tazim, 5 mana, 4/5, flying and landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, tap target creature an opponent controls, and if the land is an island, that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. And when you're able to cast these creatures for a reduced cost for any reason, be it a medallion, a Kefnit's Monument, or a Nunesh Sphinx Sovereign, the value of being able to play a 3 mana Sphinx and then playing a land and having the Guardian Tazim tap something down is a very impactful same turn effect.
Yeah, I had a Guardian in my Zamone deck. Zamone was the one that I made. I get the name wrong sometimes because I had a student when I taught in the inner city who
similar name.
Not necessarily similar name, but looked almost exactly like her. So I keep trying to call her the wrong name, but so Zamone. That deck was basically just designed around picking up and putting down lands. It was unsummoning lands. But I have another deck that does that better, and so I eventually scrapped the deck. I don't formally scrapped it, but de-sleeved it, and it's in a pile somewhere.
Just waiting for the time to come back.
Yeah, well, it didn't feel like it was doing anything special. It felt like it was just doing normal green stuff, but it had a lot of landfall effects in there, like Guardian of Tazeen. And there were certainly a couple games where I would bounce the island repeatedly and just tap down the opponent's board and swing, usually with Rampaging Baloth tokens.
As you do in a landfall deck.
Yep.
If it isn't Adventurers and a card, it's Rampaging Baloth. And if it isn't those, I mean, what are you even doing then?
Yep. Conundrum Sphinx was always a fun one.
Yes, Conundrum Sphinx. I just had it. When it attacks, each player chooses a card name, and then they reveal the top card of the library. And if the card a player revealed has the name they chose, they put it in their hand. Obviously, it's not as a Sphinx player with a few manipulation things. You're able to put a card you want on top of your library, name it, draw it. Most of the time, everyone else is going to be losing out on it.
Mm-hmm.
But as a 4-mana 4/4 with flying, it really matches in this deck pretty well.
So it's nice that it can be an aggressive creature because it is fairly aggressively costed. It can be a political tool, but there's also the cool little bit of if you're playing something like like Sylvan Tudor, I think does it. Sylvan Tudor searches for a creature, puts it on top. I think there's an instant speed version.
All I'm thinking of is Pop.
It's Worldly Tutor and Sylvan Tutor. One of them puts it on top. But there's a green tutor for one that puts a card on top of puts a creature on top of your library, and so you can do that and then attack with Conundrum Sphinx, and you know it's there because you put it there.
I mean, this is definitely where being able to play partners with Elegath as one part of the pair. I mean, you're able to bring the best Sphinxes to the table, but you're also able to have the assistance of green's effects really be able to churn out a lot of these Sphinxes quickly, and also, like you said, be able to do some like very interesting top deck manipulation to get more value.
Elegath and Caidell was one way I was thinking, because Caidell, it's a mana dork. Elegath and Galanra is an option as well. It's a mana dork and a card draw engine, which is nice. Actually, Galanra is probably better than Caidell in this case.
The really interesting thing that people have pointed out was that if you're able to copy the mana effect and put it into the same spell, you're able to draw 3 cards, like upwards, like 2 or 3 cards, depending on the effect.
Yeah, and if you're able to untap it, yeah.
So it's a pretty good pair, and it comes it'll feed into Elegath, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah, that's a neat way to go with it. There's also Thrasios. That's what I was originally thinking of, because that's works with the Scry.
Thrasios is already a pretty busted general that might raise some eyebrows early if you're not careful.
Yeah, I think if you're going for the Simic or Quandrix, whichever one you want to call it, probably Galanra and Elegath would be the easiest way to go with it.
I would agree with that.
Although not everybody wants easy. That all depends on what you're looking for out of it. But if you're looking for a ramp into big blue stompy, that would be a way to do it.
I guess at the end of the day is when we kind of look at how do you helm a Sphinx deck, you would kind of look at some of these creatures. I'd probably put Elegath and Unesh, and maybe even Asperia the Inscrutable as the top picks. But if you're looking at or I guess even a Tempsis, because the various CMCs kind of coincide with the ability. But I kind of look at the rest, and I find they don't quite synergize well with Sphinxes as well as I'd personally like.
Mm-hmm. So, if you're ever looking to try to build one of these and try it out, but you don't necessarily want to put the cards together on paper, remember you can go on. So, if you have OBS, you can use Cockatrice, use OBS's virtual webcam, and use that as your input in Spell Table, and so other people can play in paper, and you can play using the virtual webcam in Cockatrice.
Best way to make a decision before you go grab a deck.
Yep, and I'll even do that. I use so the added step that I do is I can actually stream it by using Streamlabs OBS to capture the Spell Table game.
So essentially, you're running two OBSs simultaneously.
Yep, along with Cockatrice and and Spell Table.
That's the life of a streamer for you.
Well, you figure out how to do these things, and it was a madcap experiment that I happened to get to work about a half hour before one stream, and you know what? I've used it ever since. That's how I'm able to do things like CEDH and such, because I'm not spending that kind of money. I mean, proxies, I know, but
I mean, I think if I really put my mind to it with my collection, I could probably put something together. But a lot of the key pieces that I've heard for CEDH is, at the time being, a bit beyond me, and not something I find interesting for myself to play.
Yeah, for me, first I have to find the format fun before I'm willing to invest like that. But that's neither here nor there. I'm sure CEDH players, they enjoy their format, and that's wonderful. And it's also one of the things that helps to keep some of the people who want to play CEDH but don't want to, or keep some of the people who want to play CEDH level out of the casual pool, I guess. With those decks.
As someone who, quote unquote, is casual, I think there always needs to be a space for both. And this, I guess, this recent sort of arguments and discussions about where people fit into this sort of corner that we exist in Magic. The existence for both is allowed, and your disapproval of one or the other is also allowed, and they both can coexist at the same time.
I think about it kind of like a swimming pool, the shallow end and the deep end. You don't want people diving in the shallow end. You also don't want people drowning in the deep end.
And as someone whose younger brother, when we were kids, nearly drowned in the deep end, I definitely know what it's like to go out unprepared and fearful, and being swallowed up by the depths if you're not careful.
At least we know that won't happen when you are thinking with Sphinxes, because they will always be thinking a step ahead.
That's the hope. You always hope that your Sphinxes are smarter than you.
Yep. So, thank you very much for coming on, talking about Sphinxes. Where can people find you?
People can find me over on Twitter at Eclipsemeteor. People may also find me over on my friend's stream, Junehawk, where I'll usually be playing Magic the Gathering. And you can also now find me at the Uncommon Commander podcast, where podcasts are available on Anchor, on Spotify, and various other podcast sources.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on, and maybe you'll see me on there sometime.